I'm Myron Medcalf with the Marion Key Book Club, joined as always with Lindsay Peifer, who is the Senior Policy Analyst, AAPI Outreach and Engagement with the NEA. We are obviously talking about Minor Feelings, our second book for the Marion Key Book Club, one we're really, really excited about. The November 2nd panel is approaching rapidly. These next chapters in Education and Portrait of an Artist were obviously insightful as all of this book is. The one thing that sort of stood out to me was sort of the later chapters. It's as if Cathy Park Hong is saying, yes, there is an AAPI experience. And I'm going to describe to you this in sort of my own personal encounters and experiences, but also try to relate that to the larger community and just what it's like to be a member of that community in America. But in the later chapters, it feels like she's also saying, but now I'm going to tell you what it's like to be a woman and a member of the AAPI community. Why is that so significant? And how did that affect you as you read her writing those later chapters?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I feel like the AAPI women experience in these two chapters are so important. And we don't get this representation in very many places. And so what occurred to me when I was reading these two chapters, it's the Bechdel test. So it's a test that measures representation of women in fiction and movies. And so if you have at least two women, preferably two women that have names, right? And they're talking to each other about something other than men. And so what I thought about here is we have an experience where we have three Asian women that are talking to each other about who they are, about their identity, about art and being creative, right? And it's not centered around men. It's not centered around whiteness. There's definitely a response to, right? It's that push and pull of how do we discover our own identities in this white supremacy culture? But I was really moved by the fact that we hardly ever see Asian women in their full agency, in their relationships with one another, them being human beings. And so there are a couple of I'm so sorry about my cat in the background. There are a couple of quotes in this chapter in Education that she says on page 115, it's still fairly uncommon to read about female friendships founded on their aesthetic principles. And this whole chapter, you see these three women, and the last page of that chapter, she says, when I wasn't racked with insecurity, I was wildly arrogant. All three of us were. We had the confidence of white men, which was swiftly cut down after graduation upon our separation, which when each of us had to prove ourselves again and again, because we were at every stage of our career underestimated. But I wouldn't have had it any other way. That struggle kept me faithful to the creative imagination cultivated by our friendship, which was an imagination chiseled by rigor and depth to reflect the integrity of our discontented consciousness. And I think that relationship was so beautiful to see three women being like discovering who they are. And then we go to the next chapter, Portrait of an Artist, and you see the vulnerability is to be an Asian woman. And the Cha's murder in here, there are so many points in here. The lack of coverage that we see even today in media when it's a person of color that disappears, that is murdered. We've seen that recently, right, in Contrast. And that's been like this, she was murdered in 1982, is that right? And yeah, so we see this as a huge problem. Also, I was really, this on page 173, I sometimes avoid reading a news story when the victim is Asian because I don't want to pay attention to the fact that no one else is paying attention. I don't want to care that no one else cares because I don't want to be left stranded in my rage. And that I think is really profound. I think that's where we have been in the last year and a half, like stranded in this rage. And we saw the media cover it, right? Like it was it was in the news, and then now it's not. And the violence is still happening. The Asian hate is still happening. The violence against Asian people, Asian women, Asian elders is still happening. So I feel like this chapter is so profound in that sense. And also she talks about, Asian women, and that in this culture, right, from being an invisible in girlhood, and then as an Asian woman, as Asian American women will blossom into a fetish object, right? So the fetishization, the sexualization, and then what that leads to not trusting your own sense of self, I think is really interesting as well. And so the ask, I think, here, right, is when we think about those two chapters together, right, and isolated, the Asian woman experience. And I think if we go out, if we ask, everybody that's watching, like, if we use that Bechdel test with an AAPI lens, right, how much representation are we seeing of API women as full human beings, right? As who has agency, who have voices, who have names, right? And then how are we showing up for ourselves, for each other, in creating space that allows that voice to be heard, for people to be seen in their full human self.
Yeah, that's powerful. And I mean, to me, it's so interesting, the way she talks about that vulnerability and just sort of the weight of that, and kind of living in a world that only wants to see you if it can own you in some way, right? That if it has a piece of you, and if you don't see the human qualities in an entire community, then you certainly don't see those qualities in the women within that community. I mean, that's just a constant across the board. It just reminds me of, yes, there was always a fight being a part of a marginalized community to say, hey, I'm here, I matter, and I have value. But then women within those communities have to do double the work to also say, well, we're here too. And I think that was what was so profound. And I thought those relationships you described were very important, because it was real. And it was, hey, here's me as a young person growing up, learning how to see the world around me. We have real relationships, the highs and the lows of that. And I thought, to me, of all the chapters in this book, that was the most powerful, because she was saying, we exist and we matter, and here's our story, which, to your point, we don't see enough of that. How important do you think that is, so that we get more stories out there, that there are more tales of women in the AAPI community who, to your point, their stories aren't told because there's a man involved, but because we are humanizing them directly?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good question. I feel like we're running out of time in this video.
We always run out of time.
But it's a profound question in terms of like academia, in terms of getting things published in representation in all forms, right? In media, in literature, in film. And until we are visible and seen as an entity, until we get full representation, I think that it will always be easier to just to ignore us, to devalue us, to silence us.
Well, I think that's our time. Lindsay, as always, thank you. And I'm glad we could have this great conversation about the Marianne Key Book Club and Minor Feelings.